Hey, this is Brian with King Grizzly. I got an important video today about how to build a starter block in Elementary. You just click the folder, you click insert, you put in your pre-made sort of like Lego brick that's ready to go with all your common design patterns that you're using over and over to build every section. It's got the gaps, the padding's all figured out. It's thoughtful about tablet and mobile, and it's just ready to go to speed up your builds and also to bake consistency into the way teams are building. So it looks a little weird, but I'll explain the whole system, show you how to set up your own. For example, this is a card. If I had a section that had a dark background, let me give this a dark background real quick, just as a very, very quick intro. There's a color. I might want to have a card, right? So the card perhaps has like a white background. It's already ready to go, or maybe I don't need a card. I can delete that, and maybe what I want to do instead is have some kind of design which has an image on the left and text on the right. I can quickly go through and I can delete out the items I don't need, and I'm going to have a section that's built and ready to go basically in no time. And I probably don't need a background color. So I want to show you how to do this. Hang with me. I think you'll be excited if you stick it through to come up with your own patterns and your own block. And this should save you a ton of time, make the builds more consistent, look better, get your team on the same page. It's really powerful. I haven't seen a lot of people do this. Let me know what you think. I'll show you how to build a starter block similar to the one we use, but you can of course tailor yours to whatever your particular preferences and use cases are. So what we want to do is, we've got a site with Elementor and Elementor Pro. We're going to go over to templates and save templates. So we want to make our starter block here. I'm going to hit add new template. So for me, what I want to add is a container, right? So this is what it's going to be. It's a container panel that we're adding. You can call it whatever you want. For now, I'm going to call mine starter block. You might want to call it starter panel or starter container or whatever, Lego brick, whatever makes sense to your team. Okay, so now we're inside the template, and we can see that I've got some type of a header here and a page title. You probably have something similar. You might have a footer showing. We can safely ignore these because we're just building the template, so it's just going to be the content we build here, and then we'll load that into pages using this folder icon as like a pre-built Lego brick for building out our pages. So feel free to ignore that stuff. So what we want to do first is establish the actual starter block container. And we can choose from a Flexbox container or actually the grid container. And I'm going to choose grid. I will spare you all of my reasons, but basically it's easier to align things in grid, and Elementor will now support column and row spans starting in about a week from the time this video comes out or less. The way I got those is I just clicked the plus over here to get to my widgets, and I drag that on the page. So you can see we've got a grid now. And the first thing we want to think about is how wide do we want it and how much space we want around the sides, how much padding we want in any of these panels. And then finally, how many columns we want to have by default. So let's start with the spacing around the outside and the overall width. And what I would say is to hit publish, go ahead and save your progress here. That won't show up on the front end of your site, by the way. It's just under your templates. Then we're going to go to site settings up here. And we want to go to layout. And I fiddled with mine a little bit already. I changed my content width, which was the default of 1140. I just changed it to 1200. There's lots of theories around what widths are good widths. We won't get into all those today, but choose a value that works for you. And then for the container padding, that is the space around the outside of the content, I just went with 60 pixels desktop, and then on tablet I set it to 48, and on the phone I set it to 24. Oftentimes I'll use a percentage for left and right on the phones, like 7% or so, but for this, pixels can work well. And then a default gap, and so the gap is the space between the elements we put inside the container, which we'll get to very soon. So once you set these up to your satisfaction, you can click Save Changes and then exit out of Site Settings. So once we're satisfied with that, one more thing I should mention is you'll notice that our default starter block is set to boxed width. So I could limit that. Right now you can see mine's 1200, but I could limit that to even be less. It's just the width, the max width the content will ever get to. I'm fine with the 1200. Now you may have, for some reason, want the need to set this to full width. where you could actually go, it would just keep stretching forever. And if I didn't have any padding, you could see this especially well. See how the grid actually goes all the way to the side, and no matter how wide my screen gets or narrow it gets, it'll always be full width. I don't actually want that. I want to go with the box width right here, and I'm going to leave it to my default global setting, right? Then I'm going to go ahead and on the desktop, I'm going to make this 12 columns. 12 columns is a great layout system because it's divisible by itself. 6, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's very versatile. Lots of graphic designers use it in Figma and other design programs to build out their multi-column designs, which we're going to speak about soon. And then you can choose the number of rows you have by default. And you may decide that you like to have 2, 3, 4 rows, or what I do sometimes is I click on the pencil and just type auto. I'm not sure how durable this will be, but it actually so far seems to be working for me. So we've got our outer grid set up, and I would suggest putting a class on it. So the way we do it is we put KG for King Grizzly, or if you had a client, you could maybe put their initials, then I put an underscore, and then I name the thing. So for this, I'm gonna put block, right? But by doing something like this, then we can write, if we write any CSS, we can namespace it underneath this KG block, so it won't affect the default Elementor system at all. Any CSS we write for KG block will only apply to grid containers that have that class. You can see that sometimes the layout here looks a little funny. If I click on my grid, go back to layout, and I mess around with this grid outline, it will sometimes fix. It's still a little buggy, but I'm using the beta here, so in a week or two this may be a little more stable looking, but I don't think you need to worry about that. So now we want to start building, and we have to think about what are the different types of content layouts we typically find ourselves building. So one, if we look at a recent site we're working on, is the left-right patterns, right? Text on the left, image on the right, so forth. And you notice that this text, the space between this heading and this paragraph is much smaller than the space between these two rows, right? So this space in the middle is kind of big, but this space here is much bigger than the one in here. So we have to think about our gap control. If I start adding things to the grid, so let's just do a test. I'll throw an image in there. So image, and then I click on advanced. This is going to be the new feature that will soon be available to everyone. Let's say I make this 6 columns wide. There we go. And then I duplicate it, I'll duplicate it a few times just so we can see what I'm talking about. This grid is set to a 24 pixel gap by default from the global settings. But if you look at a design like this, it's kind of nice to have a little more breathing room between content. Like these are in the same section, so to speak, right? Like they're probably in the same wrapper grid container because they are related content in a sense, whereas like this is kind of the next section. This would be a new block, right? This would be a new KG block. But these, they're not necessarily needing to be new blocks. Like it makes sense for them to live in the same block. So what I'm trying to get at is that we need to think about the concept of having rows, the concept of having columns, and then the concept of parent and children. So like if this is a column here, the gap is much smaller in this child than the overall container here. So we need to think about our block. On the top level, do we really want the gap to be 24? We might want it to be something quite larger, like maybe 60, which creates sort of a nice symmetry to that outer padding, right? And opens up some nice breathing room. But where my mind starts to go is if these things start to stack on mobile. So watch this. And this is why we'll want to make sure we have some sort of accommodation for the concept of a row. So I'm going to put some text in here, and we'll make it 6 columns wide. And it looks pretty nice. And I could click on advanced and align it to the vertical center compared to the neighbor. That looks pretty good. But when we get down to tablet, it's still okay. And then when we get to mobile, what we'll notice is that is way too much space from this picture to its related text. We would probably want that to be much smaller. So if I click on the grid and I I start to change this, so it inherited the 60 from the desktop, right? If I change it to something smaller, like 24, maybe that looks good. I still think it could be smaller. Maybe I do 18 or maybe I do 12. And then I think, okay, this looks nice. However, let's say we wanted to do a TikTok pattern similar to this. So if I take this image, I copy it, and then I paste it. Maybe I'll do the same. I'll duplicate my text. So we've got our TikTok going on. We go down to tablet. Looks pretty good. We go to the phone, and then I realize, ooh, well, number one, I don't love the order here. I want this text. I would love this text to go under this image. So I'm wondering, how do I do that? There actually is a way using a custom span. But also I'm noticing that the space between these isn't like, it's maybe not ideal. So this is a paragraph, so it actually has space underneath it, which I usually get rid of using CSS. So if we were to do what I normally do, which is at the theme level, I might say margin bottom 0. I have to maybe target the paragraph there. So if we had that going on, then what you'll notice is things get really tight. There's not enough breathing room. So just for the demo here on mobile, you'll see that this picture and this text are one thought, and then these are another, but they're too close together. So I would still like to keep a bigger gap on that parent grid. I had changed it to 12, but maybe I'd want it to be more like 24 or even 36, but I don't want this image to be that far away from the text. So then people will start to do things like, oh, I'll just set a negative margin on the top of that. But that's not a durable design system. All of this is to show that what we really need is a concept for rows. So we can put individual widgets in here, but we need to be thinking of columns and rows, and then the spacing in the children versus the spacing in the parent. I know that's a lot, but this will be worth it, believe me. So what we can do is go back and add in, let's add in, first of all, a container. So I'm going to go to my widgets. This time I'm going to add in a Flexbox container because it gives me good control over the order of things. So if I click on container and then I go to advanced, I can set a column span. Let's say we want to do something like 4. And then inside of it, I'm typically going to need, when I build a new section, a heading. I'm going to need my text, and I might need a button. These are things I commonly would need. Where's button at? Button. There it is. There we go. I don't need this container to have all that padding, so I'm going to 0 that. So there we go. For the sake of demonstration here, I'm going to colorize the background. You probably won't want to do this, but there's a little color so we can see where that's at. So this is effectively a column, right? And it's set to 4. If I duplicate it, and then I duplicate it again, you can see it makes sense how these things are spreading out over the grid. And if I duplicated it again, it would wrap, and it looks pretty nice. If we go check on the phone, this looks pretty nice. And what's cool about it is on the individual columns, so if we go back here, I can set the gap for those independently of the parent level grid container. So on this column, maybe I don't want 24, maybe I want 12, okay? And like I said, you'll probably want to set up your typography alongside this. Like if you don't typically keep any space below your paragraphs, then that will affect how much gap you want. But let's just say I wanted 12, and then I decided that 8 looked good, and then on the phone, maybe I thought 6 looked good. Something like that. I could copy that style. Copy. I'm going to go multi-select these. Paste style. And here we get better vertical spacing on these and still generous grid gaps from the parent. So this is getting better. And on tablet, I could probably just go to my parent and adjust. I don't know if I need 60. Maybe 48's going to be good. And especially if I'm doing something like let's say we get down to this size and I change this span to 6. I'm going to copy that style, go to these others, paste the style. That's pretty nice. We get down to the phone and you can see we've got a pretty nice flow here. So the outer padding on this was 24. So I might change my gap to match to 24. Whoops, not 24, 36, 24. So now the sort of contextually related items have a nicer, tighter gap than the space between each of the sort of individual items. These are what I'm going to call columns. And by default, what I would suggest is have one column built into your design that has no padding on it. This would be for when you want to build something that has no background color, but you want it to align to your 12 pixel, right? Like you want it to snap there to the left and fit nicely on your grid. So by default, I think we want one column like this. You can decide how wide you want it to be across desktop, tablet, and mobile by default. Like maybe you decide like, I'm usually doing 2 up, so I'm just gonna make 6. Or maybe you wanna stick another widget in here, like an image, and make it 6 wide and control it like that. So I think that that's a really great way to start. And then what you also want is to duplicate that. And then you want to have a version with padding. This is for card-based design. So if I added some padding on this one, like 36 pixels or 24, this would be for instances where you probably are going to reverse this out or you're going to colorize it. So like this one might actually have a background color. That's a design pattern we see a lot, is that there's a background color, or you actually decide to give your grid, the whole grid has a background color. So like maybe this has a background color of something like a web gray, and then you have a card over here which is actually going to be white or something like that. So this is I think a good option to have 2 types of columns, one with no padding, one with padding, and you could maybe even name it with something like the convention card, just to help yourself identify what that is. I'm going to clear out that gray. I don't need that. So we're making some really nice progress with our starter block, but there's still a couple things we want to bake into this to save ourselves tons of time and create a lot of consistency. And the first is actually that I did not finish solving that dynamic that I showed you of on the phone or mobile, what happens when you have, say, related content that are spaced out by these parent gaps. So let's just duplicate this column without the padding. And let's pretend we were building a layout like I showed you with the image on the left. So I'm going to add an image. We'll get rid of the text. Delete, delete, delete. And then I'm going to click on the top level, which, by the way, this is named, by default, this is named grid. You should name it whatever makes sense for you when you're adding panels to pages. I think sometimes it's a good idea to do something like section name, and then that'll remind you to name your sections. And you also might want to look into, under the additional options, what HTML tag do you prefer? You might actually prefer that it goes with section. That's probably a good choice. So you can set that here so you don't forget. And then finally, on the container settings, align the content middle, perhaps. Oops, sorry, wrong one. Align the items to center, and you'll get a nice alignment. You don't have to do this, but you may have a preference for how things align by default. You can always, as you're building, override that. So this looks good, but I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the column with the image. I'm going to move it down here, and then I'm going to duplicate the text we made that went with it. What I want to show you is that this looks nice on desktop and it looks nice on tablet, but when we get to the phone, the problem is there's no visual hierarchy here. Like this image and its text are spaced the same distance from the next image and its text. And additionally, they're not really tucked into the same wrapper. So these are all kind of at the same level. It would be better to introduce the concept of a row where we can space those rows out better. So we do want these 2 types of columns. So I'm going to keep a column with no padding and a column with the card spacing, but they're not really necessarily connected to each other. I guess if you were only doing like one row like this, then this acts as the row, the top level. But if we're going to be nesting multiple bits of content into the same thing, it would be a good idea to figure out how to put a row inside. There's a couple ways we could start building the row in here. I think the row should be built as another grid so that we can arrange our columns on it. We can either copy this row and paste it inside itself and it'll bring in all the same settings, or we can insert a new row. But before we do that, I think we should determine if on tablet and mobile we want to keep 12 columns and what we want those gaps to be. So on that top level grid right now, it's going to be 12 columns. We've got a 48 pixel gap set. If we play with that, let's say it was 12, you can see the space in between them changes somewhat significantly. I might choose something a little more modest in between them. That looks pretty good. It might be a little tight. I'm going to try 36. And then on the phone, sometimes people decide to go with something other than 12. So by default, it tries to go to one column on the phone, but we could maybe say something like 4 or maybe 6. And you may have to show and unshow these outlines here to get what you need. And another thing to look out for is on your columns. You need to make sure that you adjust your column spans to fit the number of rows that are available on the different devices. So if I had this set, maybe I just want to set it to 12 on everything. Well, number one, there's not enough room for the gaps in between them on there, so that becomes difficult. So you may have to change that to something like a percentage, or you might want to go with like 6, 4, or 2. Really, on a phone, I don't see people doing much more than 2 columns, but I kind of like 6. So if we do 6, that works. If we set it to 4, then we need to go to our columns, and we'd also need to make those go to 4. And I need to go to this next column and also make it go to 4. So now they'll be 100% wide when we select that grid, and I may need, again, to mess with those outlines to get the effect out. So you can find what works for you, but it's a good idea with this first outer grid to really get your gaps and your padding and your number of columns really dialed in to what it is you want. I think for this demo, this is sufficient. Looks pretty good to me. I can check on my column what's here. 6 and 6 still work because there's 12 available. And you might decide that you even want your default columns to be 12 wide, like maybe you want them to be 100% wide. So you can set those to whatever you want. I'm going to save my progress. And then finally, I can put in that next row. I kind of like the idea of copying this row, and then I'm going to right click it and see if I can paste it into itself. Looks like it actually worked. So I'm just going to call this a row, and I can mark it up however I want. It's maybe not a section, right? So I might leave this as the default here. If you have a preferred tag you like, you can do that. So I'm going to mark that up, and then I need to make sure it spans the 12 columns. And I can't forget, on the phone or mobile, we don't want it to span 12. By default, that's cascading down, and it's causing these two to goof up. So I'm going to match, what do we go with? 4, and that fixes everybody else, okay? And we can double check that we're looking okay here. Now, we don't need the padding because we want our alignment. If I click on the row, go to advanced, I'm going to 0 the padding. Then we get perfect alignment. And we're already loaded up with our 2 types of columns, the one with no padding and the one with the card design. So we're well on our way here to having a row concept. So let's see how this will solve the dynamic we ran into earlier where we had the tick-tock. So I'm going to duplicate this. You'll see we're already getting our nice gaps from the parent gap settings here of 60, but let's go to this row and let's turn this into one of those tick-tocks. So I'm going to delete this. I don't need the card. Here's a column. I'm going to duplicate the column, and on one of them, let's put in the picture. And you might want to build a picture into your starter block or an image. It's not a bad idea, or a video. It just kind of depends on what your trends are when you're building. I just noticed we always have, it's usually images, headings, paragraph copy, and buttons. Okay, so here we go. This is our our row. It looks pretty good to me on desktop. Like I think I like matching my gaps on the desktop to the parent's gaps. As we go down in size, our parent gap goes to 36, 36. I think I still like that. When we get to the phone, then we have a gap of 24. This is where I might choose to tighten up more. So instead of 24, maybe I'm going to go with something like 12, or I think we had maybe talked about 8 or 6 earlier. Find something that looks good. But this is what's nice. If I duplicate this again, then what we're going to get is the parent gap of 24. So just to accentuate this, I'm going to delete this. We'll click on one of these, and I'm going to set a very small gap just so we can see it. So if I have a space of like 4, and I'm just going to give this a negative margin for the sake of demonstration. You would want to do this, whoops, with CSS. So let's say we've got, boy, I'm really having issues today. Something like that. It's much tighter. We take that row and we duplicate it. We start to get that breathing room. I may change my mind actually on the parent level about how much row gap I want. I might want it to be 36. So if we go take a look down here now, you get that nice breathing room. And then I probably would say, 6 is a little tight. Maybe we'll do 8. Well, that's actually the column. Maybe we'll, on the row level, we'll do something bigger. I'll do 8. And you can see on the desktop tablet, it still looks good. I can reverse these if I want to, right? Like that. So we've got our TikTok design going on. We can check them on tablet and then on the phone. What you'll need to learn to do using Grid on the phone, most likely, is learn how to reverse items. So I can take one of these columns, and this is cool because the columns are Flexbox. Number one, I can reorder content in the columns. So if I needed to, I could click on the column and I could say change the direction of the content inside. Or I could even click on the individual items, go to advanced, and I could go to order, and I could set a custom order. Like I want this to be second or third. You have to number them all sometimes to make it work perfectly, but that works well. But we don't actually want to do that. We just want to reverse our columns. But on the Grid, there's no way to just reverse them like with Flexbox in the same manner, but there is a way to reverse them. So what we can do is on the columns inside, where we are thinking about how we want this to span, I believe you can number these. So I think I can go to custom and I could type like 2. Check it out. It moves down to row number 2, problem solved. And then on the other sizes, we can just make sure we can put in whatever row span we want. We only have one row on these others, so it doesn't matter. But you can see it's easy as you're building to go in and adjust and reverse things. So I think our row is looking pretty good. I will, now that I've been fooling around with this, I'm going to keep the one that I liked the most. So now we have a column for no padding, a column for card, and then we have the option to have rows for those times when we need something like this, where we want to group content. And you might want to do something like this, name. It's up to you. I don't know what naming conventions everybody prefers, but whatever makes sense to your team. So the last type of content I think we might want to build into a starter block. The last type of content I think we might want to build into a starter block would be some kind of heading, like for a section like our program includes. And you have to think about having maybe a max width. So one way I've thought about doing this is you could just click on that parent container, parent grid, stick in a heading, move it up to the front, and make it span 12 columns. This is pretty tidy. I could center it too if I'm wanting to keep my markup lean and if I have a short heading. But when I'm building lots and lots of panels, I probably want a consistent way for the team to be building these panels. And if I have a long headline, like that. Then it gets to be too wide, uncomfortable to read. And then we start to have to think about, especially using grid, well, how do we want to do this? Because if I make this, say, 6 columns, it gets narrower, but then it lets other content move up. So one thing I could do is, if I remember how to do this, I could go to custom, and so I could say go to from 3 to 6, or from 3 to 9. Kind of works, but it's confusing. And this one here, if it was set to less than 6 columns, would flow back up over here and get in the way. So then I would have to go and set this to start on row number 2. I don't really want to have to do that. And as the screen gets smaller, the columns might get a lot smaller and make my text feel really scrunched. So I don't think that this is actually the best way to do this. I think what we should do is take our column here and duplicate it and throw this away. And we want to make the column itself 12 wide, but then the content, we want to limit the width on it. And there may be a good way to do it potentially is to look into limiting our content width to a boxed width, where we slide that down and we could center that content and keep the limit there. So if I paste that heading again, it's not going to get any wider than a certain amount. That could be good. And of course I can style that headline, and I can style this subtext, and then they stay centered. So what we have here is it's just a regular column, but it would operate as a pretty nice like block to have available when you need to build a panel that has maybe a heading like this, or a heading and some subtext. I don't know if I have one here that's quickly available to show you. Yeah, like our wraparound services here. We don't want this text to get much wider, then it becomes hard to read. And we also want the breathing room in between the heading and the paragraph to be somewhat small. So I think this is a smart approach. Even though it is nesting it one more layer, it's all ready to go. And you can even make adjustments. Like if you like your paragraph copy to be a little wider than your headline, or vice versa, you can make adjustments. So you could come to your headline here and give it a little outside padding on left and right, or you could do that here, or play with margin, or play with some kind of a max width setting where it's like a percentage width. You could set it to like 85%. You can play around with what works well for you. And of course, style it for desktop, tablet, and mobile. But you're going to get your similar gaps as you would have here. Well, you get the same, right? So that's the benefit. So I think these are the main pieces you generally are going to want. You're going to want the column, which operates as sort of like a section headline area, and then when you're building a page you can delete what you don't need. Then you have these freestanding columns, and then you have a row. So I'm going to publish our progress here, and let me show you how to use this then. So that's done. I'm going to go out, whoops, I'm going to go to the WordPress backend, and we'll just put in a test page. So we'll go to pages, and well, here's a sample page. Let's try that. Edit with Elementor. Okay, then what we can do is click on our folder, go to My Templates, and there's our starter block. We're going to click Insert, and then click Don't Apply. We don't want the page styles that the template was built on to come with. We just want the template. I'm going to hit Don't Apply, and what it will do is it will bring in that all ready to go, and then I can get down to building, right? So on this one, maybe I say, oh, I only have a section heading, so I don't need that. I definitely want the row design because this is going to be a multi-row thing, so I'm going to get rid of this like that. I'm going to name my section. This is a features, features section, right? So maybe this is a row explaining a feature, and I actually don't need the card design, so I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to duplicate this. And this one over here actually is going to be a video. And so I pop a video in there like this, and I throw out what I don't need. And I have already laid out this section quickly. Oh, that's not the headline I want. I type in or paste in whatever my heading is, and then I can check this on tablet and mobile. And you can see I forgot when I built the initial template for that sort of column to introduce the section area, I needed to go through and make sure I had the right column width set across all device sizes. So you need to double check those. But you can see it's already, I already built the section almost. I would probably reverse that video column here, right? So I could just say, this column here with the text, I want it to be on the second row. So I'm going to go to custom and we'll just say go to row 2. But there we go. And we've already kind of built the section, and I can name it, and I can name my columns if I want, and it's going to be really consistent. And then I go down and I click on the folder and I build the next column. So I know that was a long, kind of arduous video, but you build what works for you and take away the good parts from this. And I think you'll find that this makes your sites look way better, a lot less sort of like mental overhead to build once you figure out your block, which is surprisingly hard. And then you can start combining this with other techniques, like with how you set up your font styles, how you set up your color controls, and then you can really even get into things like variables for padding and gaps, which we're creating some other videos along those lines. But yeah, let me know what you think, and thank you for watching. If you made it this far, you're a hero. Thanks so much.